Hello friends, in this video we are going to discuss about the constitutional developments in India, particularly Company Rule, that is from 1773 to 1858. In the syllabus of UGC NET in section 7, Political Institutions in India, the first part deals with making of Indian Constitution, colonialism heritage and the contribution of international movement to making of Indian Constitution. But when we are covering this portion, we usually cover only what is there in the Indian polity by M. Lakshmikant. But from analyzing the previous question papers, questions were asked about the contributions of international movement and political movements at that time also. The chronology of these movements are very important. This video is also useful for UPSC Civil Service GS2, Political Science Optional, SSC and other state level examinations. Now about the course outline. The course covers Introduction, Chronology, Regulating Act of 1773, Amending Act of 1781, Pitt's India Act of 1784, Act of 1786, Charter Act of 1793, Charter Act of 1813, Charter Act of 1833, Sati Regulation Act of 1829, English Education Act of 1835, Charter Act of 1853 and finally with recommended reading and references. Introduction. The English East India Company was founded in India on 31 December 16,000 and chartered by Queen Elizabeth. Central to the enduring strength of the company was its organization as a joint stock enterprise. It has centralized direction through a 24-member court of directors, stability of archives, and a staff recruited for specialized skills. Two major wars were fought by British before the establishment of East India Company Raj, that is Battle of Plassey and Battle of Buxar. The Battle of Plassey. The Battle of Plassey was a major battle that took place on 23 June 1757 at Plassey in Bengal. Determined to extend their profits, British in Bengal had by mid-century began systematically abusing the right to free trade awarded for them. In 1756, on the outbreak of war, to deter the French attack, the British began extending the fortifications at Calcutta. All this the young Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah rightly saw a challenge to his authority. Hence, in 1756, he marched on Calcutta, defeated the garrison and imprisoned those who were unable to flee. Some 40 or more of those imprisoned, confined on a small room, died overnight of suffocation. To avenge this humiliation, the British turned to Robert Clive. Clive entered into a conspiracy with a group of merchant bankers headed by Jagat Seth. Together, they fixed upon the disaffected general Mir Jafar. The result was a famous Battle of Plassey on 23 June 1757. After the Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar was replaced by Mir Qasim. Mir Qasim sought to retrieve his authority over at least the northern part of Bengal. By 1764, the battle lines were drawn between Mir Qasim, allied with the Nawab of Oudh and Mughal Emperor on one side and the East India Company on the other. The result was the 1764 October, the Battle of Buxar. Through this battle, the British made themselves the masters of Eastern India. Following the battle in 1765 by a treaty with Mughal Emperor, the company secured the Diwani or revenue collecting rights over Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. In 1772, as a method of compromise, determined at last to put an end to the chaos and physical disorder as intervention had precipitated in Bengal, the company's director appointed Warren Hastings, a man with a distinguished record of diplomatic and commercial service in India, as the first Governor-General of Company's India's territories. Hastings led an enduring foundation of British Raj in India. Linked to appointment of Hastings as Governor-General, the first series of Regulating Act, which endeavoured to subordinate the company to British government, was passed. Before going to the acts, let's look into chronology. The chronology is very important. It is very difficult to find chronology in a single book, but a concise history of India by Barbara D. Metcalfe and Thomas R. Metcalfe accounts the chronology in the beginning. In 16,000, establishment of East India Company by English. 1757, Battle of Plassey. 1764, British defeat combined forces of Bengal, Awadh Nawabs and Mughal Emperor at Buxar, that is the Battle of Buxar. 1765, Emperor awards British revenue collecting rights, that is the Diwani rights over Bengal. 1773, Regulating Act of 1773. 1772, Warren Hastings appointed as the first Governor General. Following the appointment of Warren Hastings, 1773 Regulating Act was passed. 1783, India Act establishes Board of Control. 1784, Asiatic Society of Bengal was formed. Also, the regulation of Pitt's India Act. 1793, Cornwallis restricts Indian civil service position to Europeans and Permanent Settlement Act, also a Charter Act of 1793. 1786 is the Act of 1786. 1803, Conquest of Delhi, Mughal Emperor confined to his palace as pensioner. Charter Act of 1813. 1818, defeat of Marathas, British control entire subcontinent outside the northwest. 1819, foundation of the Hindu College in Calcutta. 1828, Ram Mohan Roy founds Brahma Samaj. 1829, Bentinck abolishes Sati or the Sati Regulation Act. 1835, Macaulay's Minute on Education or the English Education Act of 1835. 1853, railway construction begins. 1856, annexation of Oudh. 1857, Sepoy Mutiny or the first Indian universities were established. 1858, East India Company abolished, Mughal rulers exiled and the Crown Rule was instituted. This was a chronology from 1773 to 1858. The Regulating Act of 1773. The Regulating Act of 1773 was the first of the series of the acts passed under the Company Rule. This act was of great constitutional importance, as it was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of the East India Company in India. This act also recognized for the first time and distinguished between the political and administrative functions of the company. This act also laid the foundations of the centralized administration in India. The following changes are marked by this act in India. This include it designated the Governor of Bengal as a Governor General of Bengal and created an executive council of 4 members to assist him to make the administration in Bengal more efficient. The first such Governor General created by the Regulating Act of 1773 as a Lord Warren Hastings. Therefore, Lord Warren Hastings is the first Governor General of Bengal. Then also, it made the governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. In earlier times, these 3 presidencies were equally independent of one another. But under the Regulating Act of 1773, it made the governors of Bengal and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. Then the major change it brought down by the Regulating Act of 1773 is that it provided for the establishment of a Supreme Court at Calcutta in 1774. This Supreme Court at Calcutta comprises of 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges. Then this act also prohibits the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribes from the natives. This act strengthened the control of the British government over the company by requiring the Court of Directors. Earlier, the Court of Directors is actually the governing body of the company. The Court of Directors is made to report on its revenue, civil and military affairs in India to the British government. Therefore, this act laid the foundations for the central administration in India. The Amending Act of 1781. In order to rectify the defects of the Regulating Act of 1773, the British Parliament passed the Amending Act of 1781. This Amending Act is also known as the Act of Settlement. The major features of this Act are: first is, this Act made certain exemptions. It exempted the Governor General and the Council from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for the acts done by them in their official capacity. Similarly, it also made exemptions for the servants of the company from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for their official actions. Then, second one is that it made certain exclusions. It excluded the revenue matters and the matters arising in the collection of revenue from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It also laid down certain things about the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It provided that the Supreme Court was to have jurisdiction over all the inhabitants of Calcutta. It also required the court to administer the personal law of the defendants. That is, Hindus were to be tried according to the Hindu law and Muslims were to be tried according to the Muhammadan law. Then, it also laid down that the appeals from the provincial courts could be taken to the Governor General in Council and not to the Supreme Court. It means that the power to deal with the appeal is with the Governor General in Council. It also empowers the Governor General in Council to frame the regulations for the provincial courts and councils. Pitt's India Act of 1784. This act was significant for two reasons. First, the company's territories in India were for the first time called the British possessions in India. The second one is that the British government was given the supreme control over company's affairs and its administration in India. These are the major changes brought out by the Pitt's India Act of 1784. The features of this act are that this act distinguished for the first time the commercial and political functions of the company. It enabled the Court of Directors to manage the commercial affairs of the company. While the Court of Directors managed the commercial affairs of the company, it also created a new body called Board of Control to manage the political affairs of this company. Therefore, this act for the first time established a system of double government. This act also empowered the Board of Control to supervise and direct all the operations of the civil and military government on the revenues of the British possessions in India. Act of 1786. Warren Hastings was replaced by Lord Cornwallis in 1786. Lord Cornwallis was appointed as the Governor General of Bengal in 1786. The Lord Cornwallis made two demands to accept the post. That two demands were accepted and made in the form of an act known as the Act of 1786. This act has two important provisions. First one is that as opposed the Governor General of Bengal should be given power to override the decisions of his council in special cases, and also the Governor General of Bengal would also be the Commander-in-Chief. Charter Act of 1793. The Charter Act of 1793 gave enormous power to the company. The features of this act are that it extended the overriding power given to Lord Cornwallis over his council, that is, the power to override the decision of his council in special cases, and as the Chief Commander-in-Chief to all the future Governor Generals and Governors of Presidencies. The second one is that it gave the Governor General more powers and control over the governments of the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras. It also extended the trade monopoly of the company in India for another period of 20 years. It also provided that the Commander-in-Chief was not to be a member of the Governor-General's Council unless he was so appointed. It also laid down that the members of the Board of Control and their staff were henceforth to be paid out of the Indian revenues. Therefore, it extended the powers of the Governor-General of Bengal. Chart Act of 1813. Chart Act of 1813 is one of the most important acts as it asserted the sovereignty of the British Crown over the company's territories in India. This act for the first time abolished the trade monopoly of the company in India. That is, the Indian trade was thrown open to all British merchants. However, it continued the monopoly of the company over trade in India and trade in tea and trade with China. This act also allowed the Christian missionaries to come to India for the purpose of enlightening the people. As more and more Christian missionaries came to India, it provided for the spread of Western education among the inhabitants of the British territories in India. This act also authorized the local governments in India to impose taxes on the persons. It also authorizes the local governments to punish the persons for not paying taxes. Sati Regulation Act of 1829. Sati was a historical funeral practice where a woman sacrificed herself by sitting atop the funeral pyre of their deceased husbands. This practice, though immensely inhuman, was practiced for centuries. Christian evangelist William Carey and social reformer Ram Mohan Roy strongly opposed the heinous yet socially acceptable practice. In 1829, Governor General Lord William Bentinck passed the Bengal Sati Regulation Act, which stated that the practice of burning or burying alive of Hindu widows to be punishable by criminal courts. Incidents of sati were still being recorded in India in late 20th century, which led the Indian government to announce the Sati Prevention Act of 1987, criminalizing the aiding of sati. The Prohibition of Sati Act of 1829 also prohibits the female infanticide. Charter Act of 1833. This act was a final step towards centralization in British India. The major features of this act are: it made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India and vested in him all civil and military powers. The Charter Act of 1833 created for the first time Government of India having authority over the entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. The first Governor General of India was Lord William Bentinck. This act also deprived the Governor of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers. The Governor General of India was given the exclusive legislative powers for the entire British India. From this act onwards, all the laws were made under this act were known as the Acts. Earlier, the laws made under the previous act were called as regulations. This act also ended the activities of the East India Company as a commercial body. Now onwards, the East India Company became a purely administrative body. It provided that the company's territories in India were held by it in trust for His Majesty, his heirs and successors. The Charter Act of 1833 attempted to introduce a system of open competition for the selection of civil servants and stated that the interns should not be debarred from holding any place, office and employment under the company. But the decision of the company to introduce a system of open competition for the selection of civil services was negated after opposition from the Court of Directors. English Education Act of 1835. The English Education Act of 1835 came as a result of the Macaulay's Method. This act by the Council of India reallocated funds from the company for spending on education and literature in India. together with other measures promoting English as a language of administration and of the higher law courts. This led eventually to English becoming one of the languages of India. Charter Act of 1853. This was the last of the series of Charter Acts passed by the British Parliament between 1793 and 1853. This act was a constitutional landmark. The features of this act are: this act for the first time separated the legislative and the executive functions of the Governor General's Council. This act provided for the addition of 6 new members called legislative councillors to the council. It established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as the Indian Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the council functioned as a mini parliament, adopting the same procedures as the British Parliament. This act for the first time treated legislation as a special function of the government, requiring specialized machinery and special process. The major significance of this act is the separation of legislative and the executive functions of the Governor General's Council. The second one is that this act introduced an open system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. The convent civil service was thus through open to the Indians also. Accordingly, the Macaulay Committee, that is a committee on the Indian civil service, was appointed in 1854. This act extended the company's rule and allowed it to retain the possession of India's territories on trust for the British Crown. But this act did not specify any particular period, unlike the previous chapters. This act also introduced for the first time local representation in the Indian Legislative Council. Of the 6 new legislative members of the Governor's General Council, 4 members were appointed by the local governments of Madras, Bombay, Bengal and Agra. After the wake of the Sepoy Mutiny or the revolt of 1857, the company rule in India ended and the Crown Rule has started. Now we are coming to the end of this video. The recommended references are A Concise History of Modern India by Barbara D. Metcalfe and Thomas R. Metcalfe. Also, The Working of a Democratic Constitution, A History of Indian Experience by Granville Austin. The basic references are Indian Polity by M. Lakshmikant, A Brief History of Modern India, Spectrum. If you are new to this channel, please do like, share and subscribe. Stay connected with us and stay safe and study safe. Thank you.